Hello, everyone, and welcome to another interview in our Thriveabetes summer series. And today I am with a duo. So I'm with Philip and Theo Short. Philip has been involved in the organization in Thriveabetes and his wife Paula for a number of years. And Theo is Philip and Paula's son, who was diagnosed with diabetes in 2013 at the age of 7. So welcome very much to you both today. And first of all, I'm going to start the diagnosis story. So Theo, can I hand over to you, and can you just tell us what you remember of your diagnosis story? I know it's not very much, but tell us what you do remember so far.
So I remember going to the toilet a lot and really thirsty all the time, wetting the bed, kind of the normal symptoms. I also had a hurling match the week before diagnosis, and I really didn't feel like I was playing properly. I just didn't have the energy and couldn't do as much as I usually could. So I kind of felt like something was wrong. So we went to the doctor, and he kind of just sent us immediately to the hospital. It was all a bit frantic. I don't really remember much of that. So I remember not being told very much about diabetes. I really didn't know what it was to begin with for quite a long time. People kind of just did the injections for me, did the finger pricks, didn't really know what they were doing, but I knew that it had to be done. And only had a very basic explanation of what diabetes was.
Okay, so Philip, can you take up the story then and tell us from your side of the fence the diagnosis story, because we've got two versions of it here.
Yeah, so exactly what Theo said, really. We noticed the symptoms, and we found Theo secretly drinking water during the night. And sort of he hadn't wet the bed for years, and then suddenly this started again. And then we found him sort of hiding away in the bathroom, secretly drinking water, and realized that there was something a bit awry here, because he was really intelligent little lad, and why would he do this? So we googled it, and that was the first thing that came up, was possible type 1 diabetes. So like you said, we went to the GP and then went straight to hospital, and he was admitted and was probably in for about a week, I think. So it was a huge thing to take on board. My dad and my grandmother both had type 2 diabetes, but I never really knew that much about it and didn't know what the difference was between type 1 and type 2 and what did it mean. So it was a huge learning curve very quickly for me and Paula to take on all this new stuff, and at the same time having to get around needles and finger clips and everything. And I'd had like a lifelong fear of needles, so I needed to get over that. Suddenly having this perfect little 7-year-old boy in his legs and having to put needles in, and it was a really upsetting time.
And do you remember when I know you suspected it when you were taking Theo to the hospital, but when did that conversation actually take place in the hospital with a doctor or a nurse?
I remember that Paula took him in to start with, so she would have had that original conversation, I think, and then I was a little bit behind. I kind of had to look after our other daughter, and then I went in later on. So I wasn't actually there for that kind of original conversation that they had.
But you would have sat down for some of the kind of the training and the education stuff during the week.
Yeah, I mean, once Theo was in there, then we were there. It felt like we were there for the whole week. Obviously, we were coming home to sleep, but we were there all the time and trying to take on board what was going on and what this was going to mean for all of us going forward.
Yeah. So Theo, I'm going to ask you the next question, because those first few years, actually, it was a very short time that you were on injections before you moved on to the insulin pump. So that in our pre-interview chat, you said that has made a massive difference in being able to take care of your diabetes and empowering you. So can you just talk us through life on injections and then the difference going on to pump and CGM?
Yeah, so for the first 3 years, I was on injections 5 or 6 times a day and the finger tests, and my control was very bad, just up and down all day, all night. The doctors could never really find a pattern, so they didn't really know what I needed to do to level it out more. But then since we switched to the pump and the CGM, it's just been like immediately more control. When I was on injections, it was kind of just you do this amount at this time of day, this amount at this time of day, and wasn't adjusted to what I needed at that moment. It was just a general amount that I had to do. So it was, yeah, very hard to stay healthy and keep good control.
And on average, how many finger stick checks were you doing per day?
Probably 10 or 15.
Just to stay aware of where you were.
Yeah.
Okay. And so on the injections, then you weren't taught how to adjust the insulin levels for balancing activity and, you know,
Yeah,
food
exactly,
more
yeah.
or less. Okay.
Yeah, and we didn't start carb counting for quite a long time. So it was, yeah.
Wow. Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, as soon as we started that as well, that made a big difference.
So did you start on the pump by itself, or did you have pump and a connected CGM as well?
I think we went to the CGM first. We had that
Okay.
for a bit.
Yeah.
And then we found out that I could get a pump. So yeah, as soon as they were combined, that was a life changer.
Huge. And what difference then having a pump? Because I mean, there'll be people watching this who don't use insulin pumps and are not familiar. So can you just talk us through what difference that has made?
Just a lot more freedom, rather than not wanting to eat something because I'd have to do an injection. I have a lot more freedom to do what I want, and I can just pump. It's a lot more discreet as well. People don't usually ask questions and stare at you looking funny, which is really nice. And just being able to have a bit more normality in your life.
And then, because you mentioned before when we talked that you are involved in I won't say sports, but I know there's some activities you're involved in. So how has it helped you balance those activities with blood glucose levels?
Yeah, the CGM definitely helped with that. Being able to see what my blood is throughout the whole game or the session of training or whatever. Knowing that I can take off my pump and put it back on whenever I need to have something. That really helped as well. The alarms for when I went low was great because I didn't have to rely on just how I felt. So I was able to act sooner so that I could keep going.
Excellent. Okay, so Philip, going back to you, we talked a lot about the early days of attending clinics and your involvement with Thriveabetes and access to other parents. So, like, what do you wish you had sooner in those early days of being a parent of a child with type 1 diabetes?
Yeah, I think two main things. The first one would be emotional support, just having someone else who was there who'd perhaps gone through it and could tell us honestly what it was like, or to be able to help us through what we were having to deal with, trying to get information and then relaying that to Theo in an age appropriate way. Yeah, I think somebody did say to us once that it's just difficult for the first 2 years and then it's all better. Not sure what their experience was, but I don't know that's true for anybody. But no, we could have really done with some kind of help to know, yeah, what we were feeling. Is this normal? What is going to happen? How do you cope? Because we left the hospital and we're suddenly kind of on our own with it. That was one thing. I feel as well that we were only told a certain amount, which maybe I understand. I mean, it's a lot for anyone to take on board exactly what diabetes does to your body and how it affects the family. But I think we would, as a family, we would have been ready to hear more. Like Theo said, it was a long time before we were introduced to carb counting. At the time, the hospital we were with didn't offer pumps to Theo's age group, so that wasn't even a possibility. But at the same time, we could have taken on carb counting, and that would have helped Theo. I feel like that the first ways that we treated his diabetes were really not great. Just these random injections of set amounts that, oh, well, it's morning time, so you must have 10 units. It would have been nicer if we'd actually been told about carb counting. We were always told that one day we will do carb counting, and we thought, wow, I wonder what this is. What how is this going? And then eventually it was like, oh, okay, so you just know how many carbs, and then that balances out against the insulin that you need. It's not that complicated. We could have done that. So that was annoying when we found that out. I wish we'd been told that at the beginning. So those are the two main things that it would have been nice to have known more about. We didn't know about Thriveabetes at the time.
Well, it didn't exist.
Thriveabetes didn't exist. Yeah, that's why we didn't know. But support groups and things like that, we didn't really have anything local to us. Yeah, my wife Paula tried to set one up for a little while, just to try, because she's a counselor and psychotherapist, so she was trying to help maybe other parents who were going through what we'd gone through. But it would have been great to have had that from the beginning. Even someone there in the hospital, here's a number, here's a group that will help you. That would have been really good.
Yep, and those are all the things I love to hear, because I advocate for having peer support for any family that's going through diagnosis, whether it's the adults or the kids and the parents. And I would like to point out at this point in the interview that the clinic you were attending at that time was going through some major challenges in terms of staff resourcing. And at the time of your diagnosis, or Theo's diagnosis, there was that crossover period of the implementation of the National Clinical Guidelines for Children on Pumps. So you were kind of lost in that loophole as well. So my hope is that things are better now, that new parents do have access to the carb counting quicker. The support we're working on, I hope. So Theo, so you were 7 when you were diagnosed and you were in school. And I asked you a couple of questions when we were chatting before about going back to school and how your friends reacted and teachers. And you told me an interesting story about how you approached the transition from primary school to secondary school. So could you share that with us?
Yeah, so when I first went into first year, my sister had already been in the school for 2 years. So mum and dad knew the teachers fairly well, knew the principal well. So they arranged for me to go in to see all of the teachers after school. And I just basically spent an hour with mum explaining to them what diabetes was, what I needed to have with me at school, what a hypo was, what a hyper was, what I needed to do when that happened, why I needed my phone with me, loads of different things. They were really supportive of that, and they were all really happy about it. And that just made secondary school a lot easier, rather than explaining to each teacher individually. They all just had a fairly good knowledge of it, and then they could just ask questions whenever they wanted.
That's excellent. I mean, you effectively trained your teachers in how to help you manage your diabetes during school. And I mean, it may not be possible for all families to have that kind of arrangement with the school. And I've heard lots of stories where there have been difficulties in secondary schools because it involves so many different teachers and moving them around. And every year there's a new batch of teachers. So it's excellent to hear such a good and positive story from a secondary school. And back to you, Philip, now. Actually, we're going to take a break here before we continue in part 2, if that's okay with everybody. And bear with us, viewers, we'll be back in part 2.